All right, today we're going to break down a really specific piece of legislation from the U.S. Congress. It's called House Resolution 888. So back in late 2023, specifically November 28th, lawmakers in the U.S. House got together for a pretty significant vote on a resolution with a very direct, very powerful title. And the results? Well, it was something else. Get this, the final tally was 412 to 1. Just think about that. In today's deeply divided Congress, getting that kind of agreement on anything is almost unheard of. It immediately tells you, okay, something really big is going on here. So the big question is, what on earth could unite lawmakers like that? To figure it out, we've got to look beyond just the numbers and get into the actual text of the resolution. What does it say? And more importantly, what's the deep historical backstory it's leaning on? Let's get into it. All right, so first up, let's look at the resolution itself. The official title is Reaffirming the State of Israel's Right to Exist. But here's the thing. It doesn't just state that and call it a day. No, it actually builds a whole argument. And it starts by laying this historical foundation, kicking things off with a claim about an ancient connection. Right at the top, the very first whereas clause makes this huge statement. So you have to ask, what evidence does this whole narrative use to back that up? Let's take a look at the history and the archaeology it points to. Okay, so the argument for this connection really stands on three legs. First, you've got ancient texts. And we're not just talking about the Hebrew Bible, but also inscriptions from places like Egypt and Babylon that mention the Israelites. Second, there's the physical evidence, archaeology. We're talking ancient coins, the ruins of old synagogues, stuff you can actually touch that points to a long-standing presence. And finally, the third pillar is the historical record itself, which shows that even when other empires were in charge, Jewish communities just kept on living in cities like Jerusalem and Hebron. And that continuous presence leads us right into the next part of the story the resolution tells, which is a history that's also marked by, expulsion and persecution. See, the resolution is quick to point out that this history wasn't some golden age of uninterrupted rule. Far from it. It highlights these repeated expulsions that created what's known as the Jewish diaspora, basically communities scattered all over the world, from the Middle East to Europe. And in these new lands, they were often minorities, and sadly faced some pretty brutal persecution. And according to the resolution's narrative, this long, painful history of persecution reaches its absolute worst point with the Holocaust. The murder of 6 million Jews is presented as the ultimate, most horrific proof of just how vulnerable a people can be when they don't have a state of their own. This in turn created this powerful, modern urgency to finally establish a sovereign Jewish homeland. So this is where it gets really interesting. How does all of that historical backstory actually turn into political action in the 20th century? Because the idea of a Jewish state wasn't just some ancient hope anymore. It became a full-blown organized political movement. You can really see this path from an idea to a reality pick up steam over about 50 supercritical years. It kicks off in 1897 with the first Zionist Congress giving the whole thing a modern political voice. Then, fast forward to 1917, and it gets a huge boost from the British with the Balfour Declaration. 30 years after that, in 47, the brand new United Nations steps in with a legal framework, the famous Partition Plan. And all of this leads to that one moment, May 14, 1948, when the modern state of Israel declares its independence. So, you see, the creation of this state wasn't just about historical hopes and political drive. The argument here is that it's also built on a solid foundation of international law and actual agreements. And this is the legal framework we're talking about, the one the resolution brings up. It starts with the political nod from the Balfour Declaration. Then that gets made official by the League of Nations mandate. And that mandate is a really big deal in this story because it specifically recognizes the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land. From there, you get the UN's Partition Plan, and then the final piece of the puzzle. Israel gets admitted to the UN in 1949, which really seals the deal on its legal status as a sovereign country. Okay, so let's bring it all back to that wild 412 to 1 vote. After laying out this entire historical and legal case in the opening parts, the resolution gets down to business and makes 4 very direct, very clear points. So after all that lead up, what the resolution actually does boils down to 4 things. Number 1, it reaffirms that the state of Israel has a right to exist. Number 2, it states that denying this right is a form of antisemitism, which is a key point. Number 3, it rejects any calls for Israel to be destroyed. And finally, number 4, it condemns the specific Hamas-led attack that really triggered this whole resolution in the first place. Let's zoom in on that second point for a second, because it's probably the most debated part of this whole thing. The text draws a direct line. It basically says, look, since Israel is the world's only Jewish state, then denying its right to exist is, by definition, a form of antisemitism. The resolution lays this out as the logical endpoint of all the history and politics it just walked us through. And really, that's the main takeaway here. House Resolution 888 isn't just some quick statement about something that just happened. It's a carefully constructed document that intentionally weaves together a modern political position with thousands of years of history and a solid century of international law, all to build its argument. So all of this kind of leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? This resolution is a really powerful example of how one very specific version of history can be written down and basically turned into law. And it really makes you think, how do the stories we tell about the past, and, the parts of those stories we decide to focus on, how do they end up shaping the toughest conflicts we face today?